Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Pesachim Daf is also about different types of matzah and bread that can be used on Pesach. There are three main discussions here. Here we are discussing the shape of the matzah or the bread. So the first thing we'll speak about is thick bread. The second is bread with a design on it. And the third is not really a chametz and matzah related sugya. It's about fried and cooked breads. Obviously those are chametz, you can't use them. But the question would be, when do they qualify for challah or other usages which require bread specifically, and when do they not count as bread because they're fried and cooked? So first of all, we're discussing thick bread. So the Gemara quotes a brisa that has machokas between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Are you allowed to use thick bread? When? So the brisa says on Pesach, questionable girsa whether it's Yom Tov of Pesach or just Pesach itself. Either way, Beis Shammai says that you can't use thick bread, and Beis Hillel says you are allowed to use thick bread. The Gemara defines thick means up to a tefach thick. How do you know up to a tefach thick? Because the lechem apanim was matzah, and the lechem apanim in the Beis Hamikdash was a tefach thick. It was shaped like a shoebox to an extent, without a lid, and it was the walls and the floor were a tefach thick. So Gemara says you're going to learn from the fact that you can make bread a tefach thick in the Beis Hamikdash, that everybody's allowed to make their own matzah be a tefach thick, and we're not afraid it'll become chametz. I would not suggest learning from there because there are 5 factors there that make it less likely to become chametz. First of all, there's kohanim that are making it. Kohanim, azrizim, they're very careful. If you leave up to regular people, they'll make mistakes. Second of all, the dough there was worked very much. It was very thoroughly worked. That keeps it from becoming chametz. Next, the wood that was used, it was dry. It was cut specifically in the summer when it's hot and dry. The ovens there are hot because they're running full time, and the ovens there are made out of metal. That's different than our breads, which are not made by Kahanim. They're not worked so much to the dough. The woods can be soggy wood. The ovens aren't so hot. You're heating them up just for this. It could be a fresh, cold oven that we're trying to make bread in, and the ovens are made out of clay, not out of metal, and therefore I would not necessarily want to learn from that. Okay, now the Gemara says that somebody asked his Rebbe. The question is who? So the first version said it's Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba who asked his Rebbe who was Rav, or maybe Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba is quoting Rav who asked his Rebbe who was Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. And the question that was asked is, what is pas ava? What does it mean when we say thick bread? And he said it means a lot of bread. It doesn't mean a thick bread. The phrase pas ava means a lot of bread. Now, why do you call it a lot of bread? Why do you call it thick? Why do you call a lot of bread thick bread? Why is it called pas ava? So I'm going to give some explanations. Either that when you are kneading the dough, it's a very thick dough because you want to make a lot of bread. Or in this town, the phrase pas ava means a lot of bread. That's how it's used. That's how we understand it. Now, what would be the problem with making a lot of bread at once? It's not a chametz issue, so what's the problem? The Gemara says because you're doing it on Yom Tov, and on Yom Tov it's too much tircha, it's too much work. You're supposed to minimize the work you're doing on Yom Tov. The Gemara says if that's the case, then you shouldn't be allowed to make thick bread any Yom Tov, not Shavuos, not Sukkot, not Rosh Hashanah. It has nothing to do with being on Pesach. The Gemara says you're right. The Tana wrote this Mishnah, says Pesach because he happened to be on Pesach. But it's not halakha that's limited to Pesach. We'll even prove it because the same exact Mishnah appears, and it uses the word Yom Tov instead of Pesach. Of course, the same machok is Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai about making pas ava, and it says on Yom Tov, and it doesn't say on Pesach. So you see that that's true. Okay, now the Gemara goes to the next sugya, which is making bread with designs on it, types of images or certain shapes. So the Gemara quotes a brisa that says that you're allowed to use matzah, you're allowed to use very fine, clean flour, or you're allowed to use very coarse, rough flour and bread. And you're also allowed to use matzah that has shapes in it. Now, you're not allowed to make matzah. You're not allowed to make breads or matzahs with shapes on them on Pesach itself. But if you did make it, you're allowed to use it for the mitzvah of matzah. So why not? What's the problem? So the Gemara says that this question was asked by Baisus ben Zayin to the Chacham. Rabbi Yehuda says he asked the question, and they said to him, because we were afraid that if people are spending too much time working on the designs and the shapes, in the meantime, they'll lose track of the fact that they need to keep it from becoming chametz, and it'll end up becoming chametz. So the Gemara says that Baisus said, so then let me do it. I have a special form. I could just use like a cookie cutter shape. I can make my design in the bread in one smack. It doesn't take time. There's no problem. The Gemara says they said to him, we can't have a separate rule for you than for everyone else. We can't have your shaped bread be permitted to be made and everybody else they're not allowed to. So we have to have a general rule. So now the Gemara says, though, that it seems that there was exceptions to the rule, and possibly for this exact reason. The Gemara says that Rabbi Elazar bar Tzaddik says, I once followed my father to the house of Rabbi Gamliel, and they had designs on the matzah on Pesach, and I asked my father, I thought the Chacham said you're not allowed to make this on Pesach. So there's two versions as to what he answered. One version, and they're inverted from each other. One version is that he answered, it's only the bakers that are not allowed to make designs because they're very careful about what they do, and they want to make an exact shape because it has to go to market. But if someone wants to make it in his house, we're not afraid he's going to spend too much time on it. Okay. According to the other version, it's the other way around. When people make it in their house, they can spend a lot of time on it, and they need to do it exactly, and it may become chametz in the meantime. But a baker will have a stamp, he'll have the form, he'll have the cookie cutter shape that Vices mentioned, and therefore they're allowed to do it. It'll go quick. The Gemara ends off with a psak that's given by Rabbi Yasi. You're allowed to make designs on the bread if it is thin matzah, if it is thin cracker. If it is a thick loaf, then you cannot do that on bread that you're planning on using as matzah for Pesach. Now the Gemara moves on to discuss various types of bread that are made not in the classic oven baking procedure. So the Brisa, which we begin with, says as follows. We have sufganin. Sufganin is like from the word sufganiot, which are donuts. Rashi defines sufganin as made like a sponge. It sounds like it's a big lump of dough that is fried. So sufganin, or breads that are fried in honey, or iskeritin, which Rashi defines as made as thin wafers that are apparently also fried. Something called chalas hamasaris, which is defined as bread of the pan. And meduma, that is something which is a mixture of truma and chulin together. So all these things, you don't have to take challah from them. Now meduma, we know why you don't have to take a challah from that, because since it has truma mixed into it, you don't take challah on your truma. They're both matnas kahuna. You don't take one matnas kahuna on another matnas kahuna, and therefore you can't take challah on it. But the other ones, why don't you take challah on it? So the Gemara assumes that the reason is because they're not considered bread. They're considered to be a cooked food of some sort. You only have to take challah on bread. The question is, why are they not bread? So first of all, let's define one of these here, which is not clear. What is chalas hamasaras? What is pan bread, frying pan bread? So the Gemara defines it as chalut shel bali latim, that it's something which is made in hot. It's fried in hot pan filled with oil. Okay, now, what's the reason that these aren't considered bread? So the machlokes Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Reish Lakish says because they are made in a pot. Anything which you bake in a pot or a pan is not considered bread. Bread has to be something which is made in the oven. Now, the implication up to now has been that it's made with some type of liquid like honey or oil. The Gemara later will seem to imply that it's made dry, but either way, it's baked in a pan or a pot. It's not baked straight in the oven. And Rabbi Yochanan says, no, something which is made in a pot is called bread, and that would be chayav and challah. These things are not chayav and challah because they are baked in the sun, and that's why. So we have machlokes of Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Something which is baked in a pot is that called bread. According to Reish Lakish, it is not called bread. According to Rabbi Yochanan, it is called bread, and it's chayav and challah. This machlokes, we will now have a couple of proofs, one way or another. First of all, is a very strong proof against Reish Lakish. It has this exact list. It discusses sufganin, dufshin, the honey bread, istrikin, all these things. It says that if you make them, that they are made in a pot, then it's chayiv and challah, not like Reish Lakish. And it says, but if it's baked in the sun, then it's patur and challah. It seems to be clearly like Rabbi Yochanan. So Gemara says this is a clear proof against Reish Lakish. Gemara says not necessarily. Ula says Reish Lakish will say there's two ways you can make something in a pot. It's not so clear. Do you first heat it up and then stick the dough into it? That's like baking in an oven. That I would agree is bread and chayiv on that. My machlokes with Rabbi Yochanan is about where you first put it in the pot and then you put the pot on the fire. That's my question. And that I'm saying you're not chayav and challah. This Mishnah is talking about the other type. It's referring to, right, when it says that you're chayav, if you make it in a pot, it's referring to where you first heated up the pot and then you stuck the bread in there, the dough in there. That's just like an oven. So Gemara says, well, if you're right, that the Mishnah is saying that it's referring to, when it says you're chayiv and chala, it's referring to where you first heat it up. Then when it wants to give you a case where you're not chayiv and chala, it should say this closest case to that where you're not chayiv and chala. It should say, but if you first put it in the pot and then heat it up, so then you're not chayiv. Why does it have to go to the case of where you baked it in the sun? So Gemara says, you're right, there's a phrase missing here. You should read it that when are you not chayiv? If you first put the dough into the pot and then you heat it up, it's just like baking in the sun, because that's what happens when you bake in the sun. You first put it in the pot and then the sun bakes on it and heats up, and that's why those two are not chayiv in challah. So that takes care of that raya. Now we're left without a raya. The Gemara says, let's find another raya. The Mishnah says you could use matzah hina. Rashi defines as bread which is not baked fully. You don't have to have your matzah be fully baked as it could be. You're allowed to use that. And you're also allowed to use matzah which is made in a pot. So you see, if you could use it for matzah, then you could use it for challah. And then it's chayiv in challah. So it's a clear raya to Rav Yochanan that these things are chayiv in challah. So the Gemara says, not a problem. We will answer that, again, we are talking about where it was made in a pot, where it was first heated, and then the dough was stuck in there. Remember, we said Reish Lakish agrees in that case. Now the Gemara stops here to define what is matzah hina. How unbaked is it allowed to be? The Gemara says, as long as when you rip it in half, you don't have strings of the dough stretching and being pulled from one to the other, from one half to the other, it's okay. As long as it's a clean break, then it counts as matzah, and you're allowed to use that on Pesach and don't have to worry about chametz. Says Rava, the same halacha applies for the lachmei toida, the breads that are brought with the carbon toida. Same halacha applies. They count as bread. It qualifies as lechem if it's not fully baked, as long as you don't have strings stretching from one end to the other. Now the Gemara says, why would I think not? Matzah has to be lechem, and lachmei toida has to be lechem. The Gemara says, well, there's a different halacha that the lachmei toida have. You were afraid that would be a violation of that halacha. And it says that you need to bring 40 breads with the lachmei toida, 4 categories of bread, 10 of each. 9 of each category are given to the person who brought the carbon, and 1 of each, it says, is given to the kohen. You have to give him 1. That means you have to give him 1 whole one. You can't give him a broken bread. So you may think, if it's not fully baked, it counts as a broken bread. It's not a loaf. So that's why we're coming to tell you, no, it does count as a whole bread, and you are allowed to give it, you are allowed to use it for the carbon toida. That's not a problem. The Gemara now launches into another raya. This one will be against Rabbi Yochanan, towards Reish Lakish, that these cooked foods are putter. If they're made in a pot, they are putter from challah. They don't count as bread. The Gemara is going to quote a brisa that has no less than 5 opinions about 2 types of foods, one called me'isa and one called chalita. The Gemara will have 5 opinions. The Gemara is going to analyze one of the opinions first, and then the Gemara will discuss its raya. So first of all, me'isa and chalita, 2 things. The Gemara has a number of machlokes about it. First of all, what are they? So me'isa and chalita, the Gemara explains, are both cooked flour. In one case, you put the hot water on top of the flour. In one case, you put the flour into the hot water. So it's very similar to our halachos, where we're discussing breads or types of doughs that are made in a pot. So what's the halacha here? So the Gemara brings as follows. Beis Shammai's opinion, the Gemara says, is that you are chayev for chalita but not me'isa. Beis Hill's opinion is that you're chayev for me'isa but not chalita. So the Gemara right away says, how could that be? Why would they have inverted opinions? It seems to be the same thing. The Gemara says, you're right. It's not really machlokes Beis Hill and Beis Shammai. Their opinions are the same for both me'isa and chalita. There's just a machlokes tanoim, which one holds what. And therefore, they have 2 different versions, and there's 2 different Tanaim who said these 2 lines. But everybody agrees that really Beis Shammai holds both of these are either chayev or pater, and Beis Hillel holds both of these are chayev or pater. We just don't know which one is which, and that's why we have 2 flipped versions here. But in the next opinion, the third opinion on the subject, is Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yosi. He says in the name of his father that both of them are pater and challah, or a different version is that both of them are chayev and challah. Okay, and the last opinion, which is one that we need to focus on, is the Chachamim, and the Chachamim say it depends how you make them. If you make them in a pot, it's pater. If you make it in the oven, it's chayev. The Gemara says clear proof to Reish Lakish. You see, if you make it in a pot, it's pater. You make it in the oven, it's chayev. That's what Reish Lakish holds. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan will tell you, you're right, this Tana does so like Rish Lakish, but it's really a machlekes Tanaim, and I'm going to show you that the bread's made in a pot is a machlekes Tanaim. Where do I see that? So Gemara is going to show that by quoting a brisa, which has two opinions that seem the same. The Gemara is going to have to show that there's a case that they argue about, and Rabbi Yochanan will claim the case that they argue about is a case of bread made in a pot. What are they discussing? So the brisa is talking about me'isa and chaluta, these things which we are discussing thus far. And the Tanakama says Misa and Chaluta are not Chayiv and Chala because they don't count as Lechem. And Rabbi Yehuda says nothing counts as Lechem unless it's made in an oven. So they seem to be saying the same thing. What kind of machlokes is that? There's got to be something between Meisa Chaluta and made in an oven, and that's what they argue about. So says Rabbi Yochanan, that obviously is where it's baked in a pot. Misa and Chaluta is cooked. That, the Tanakama says, is the only thing that doesn't count. But if it's made in a pot, then it would count as bread. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, it's not considered to be bread until it's baked in the oven itself. So they're arguing over made in a pot, and therefore you see, although one of them holds like Rish Lakish, one of them holds like me, that it doesn't count as challah. So the Gemara says not necessarily that's not what they're arguing about. They could be arguing about, they could all be referring to where it's made in a pot. The question is, after you bake it in the pot, did you then go ahead, if you then went ahead and baked it in the oven after the baking in the pot? According to Rabbi Yehuda, it has to be afui b'taner. It has to be that the original baking is done in an oven. Rebaking it in an oven does not make it bread now. According to Tanakama, no. Anything which is isa and chalita, that's fine. If you rebake it in an oven afterwards, it's not a problem. It doesn't have to be that the original baking was in the oven itself. That's what they argue about, and therefore this does not prove that Rabbi Yochanan's claim that this whole issue is really a machlekes Tanaim. Now, the Gemara says, what is the source of Rabbi Yehuda's halacha? Rabbi Yehuda says it's got to be that it's baked in the bread, that it's baked in an oven. The Gemara says it's from a pasuk in Vayikra, which says V'afu es anashim lachem b'taner echad, that 10 women will be able to bake their bread in one oven. You see that it's only called bread if it's baked in an oven. Anything which is not originally baked in the oven doesn't count as bread. Now, as far as defining what exactly bread made in a pot, how does that work exactly? So the Gemara brings the following incident. The Gemara says that Rabbi Zera was sitting in front of Ula, and behind Rabbi Zera was sitting Rabba and Rabbi Yosef. And Rabba and Rabbi Yosef had questions about what's called making bread in a pot exactly. So Rabba whispered to Rabbi Zera, said, "Can you ask Ula, what if you take the pot and you stick it on the stove in the fire? Does that count as bread made in a pot or not?" So Rabbi Zera said, why should I ask him that? He's just going to say, of course, that is exactly what bread made in a pot is. That's how you make bread in a pot. So Gemara says that Rabbi Yosef said, what about if you bring the fire from on top? Instead of being under the pot, you hold the fire on a torch over the top of the pot. So then it bakes faster. What happens then? So he said, why should I ask him that? That's also obviously bread baked in a pot, because that's how the poor people do. They have less wood and they need it to cook faster, they need it to bake faster, and that's how they hold it. So obviously that counts as bread made in a pot. I don't need to ask him.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.